So I'd like to welcome everyone. This is now our third installment of the California Fire Science Seminar Series. My name is Michael Gollner from the University of California, Berkeley, and I'm co-organizing this seminar series with Crystal Colden from UC Merced and Jeanette Cobian Iniguez from UC Merced. And so we're really pleased to introduce Dr. Prichard from the School of Environment and Forest Sciences at the University of Washington. And so she has an exciting talk today on dry forest restoration and megafires. Susan is a research scientist at the University of Washington. Her main research interest is in the effects of fire and other disturbances on forest dynamics, climate change on forest ecosystems, and fuel management options to mitigate wildfire effects. Now, before we get into the webinar, I just want to give a background about how to ask questions. On the bottom of the Zoom page, you'll see the Q&A button. Please click that, and at any time you can ask questions, and we're going to read those questions out loud so the recording can hear as well. And we'll have ample time for question and answer afterwards. Following this webinar, there'll be an open sort of meet and greet virtually. And so if you'd like to participate, we sent the link out via email, but we will reshare that link in the chat box during the seminar series. And there'll be a time after we log off for everyone to log on to the other webinar where we actually get to show our faces and do that, which unfortunately we can't here. So without further ado, Dr. Prichard, thank you so much for coming to share with us today.
Thanks for having me. So I wanted to start by saying that even though the screen that I'm sharing right now has blue skies, in the Metro Valley where I live in North Central Washington, we have hazy skies. And so the smoke that many of you are probably breathing in California has also shared itself all the way up where I live. So I think that that's actually kind of fitting for this talk that I'm giving, because fires know no boundaries. We're breathing the smoke that is happening right now in, unfortunately, a very long and just incredibly upsetting fire season for California. I wish that October 1st was a harbinger of a change in weather for you, and it isn't yet, but I'm still hoping for a change hopefully soon. So with that, I wanted to share what we're learning from some exceptionally large wildfire events in North Central Washington. And I'll let you know that in this topic, I have quite a bit of fire fatigue. Even though I study fires, I love what I do. Sometimes at the end of a really long fire season, especially with knowing what happened in Australia for their summer, it gets kind of overwhelming. And so I wanted to set the tone that, yes, we're delving into what we've learned about large fires, and yes, I'm a little bit tired of them at the moment. So megafires and climate change. So I actually got into the field of fire ecology because of this very topic. One of my most inspiring professors when I was going into graduate school was Linda Brubaker, who's a paleoecologist. And she really impressed upon us that large stand replacing disturbances, such as wildfires, are agents of big change sometimes. So they effectively clear the slate and require trees to start over. As such, with warming and drying climate, they can really accelerate rates of vegetation change. So for instance, this is a post-fire landscape photo of the Carlton Complex, which I'm going to be highlighting today. And there is a very true concern that trees are going to have a hard time finding a foothold in this post-fire landscape, given the warmer, drier summers we're having. Well, in contrast to seedlings, we have a lot of fire-resistant trees along the entire West Coast and interior Western United States that are built to last. Yes, we've had some pretty big, widespread mortality events of large trees in California, but overall, mature trees have built-in inertia. They have a lot of carbohydrate in water reserves, thick bark, And when they're in this condition, which is kind of perfect for ponderosa pine and Jeffrey pine, they're adapted to a lot of light, frequent understory fires, even moderate severity fires. They're built to last. However, tree seedlings represent the most vulnerable phase of a plant's life. It's important to note that stand replacing fires open up bare mineral soil and a lot of light, and that can be really favorable for seedling establishment. But because of the shallow root systems, the low reserves, and the tiny needles, many of these tree seedlings don't survive on a good year. And we're not having so many good years for tree establishment anymore. And so this issue of large stand replacing fires is kind of a twofold issue. One is that sometimes seed source is very distant. And then two, even if seedlings establish, they're having to do so in a warmer world. And so I'm really interested in, as an ecologist, in studying how do we restore resilient structure and composition so that these forests that we all love to live near and recreate in have a better chance of survival. I know that this scene, even though this is in north central Washington state, probably looks a little familiar to those of you who have spent time in the Sierras. A lot of these large resistant conifers, such as ponderosa pine, now have a lot of neighbors because of fire exclusion. My colleague Paul Hesberg has termed this an epidemic of Douglas fir around where we live, or true fir in other parts of the western United States. This is also concerning across landscapes. Here where I live, I'm pretty close to Wenatchee, Washington, and from a fire lookout, we can see a huge amount of change from a 1934 survey photo that was taken versus a 2010 retrospective photo. Now, you can see the infilling in this photo of a lot of forest, and a lot of this forest is coming in on south-facing slopes that are not as great for trees. You can even see a little bit of a western spruce budworm outbreak here too. So these landscapes are filling in and becoming a little bit more contagious, not only for fire, but often insects and disease as well. Even though they're native, they're taking on a bigger role in these landscapes than they might have historically. When the media contact me, I often get some questions that are a little bit frustrating these days about, like, well, is this all climate change? You know, are fires all climate driven? Or do we need to rake the forest? There's like funny things that are happening in the media these days. And I come back conceptually to this diagram that was inspired by Max Moritz and Meg Krawczyk, I believe, in one of their papers, where we can see that, you know, there's always a balance between climate and fuels. It's certainly not either or. And I'm just going to walk through this slide really quickly. So fire currents, we can imagine hypothetically being pretty low in rainforests. So whether we're talking about temperate or tropical rainforests, they might have plenty of fuel to burn from down in the base, a lot of wood and moss and herbaceous vegetation all the way up through multi-layered canopies. However, most years, they're just too wet to actually ignite and carry fire. Whereas on the opposite end of this spectrum, we have very low fire occurrence and spread in deserts. These ecosystems are plenty dry, almost every day to carry fire, but the discontinuity in fuels means that they carry fire very infrequently. Well, we happen to be talking about the Sierras, the north central Washington. Western United States has a lot of this mixed conifer forest that happens to be in kind of the Goldilocks phase, where there's plenty of fuel to carry fire, and climate is not so limiting to fire. We get a lot of summer wildfires in a lot of these areas. Now, thinking about climate change too, this teeter-totter helps me because some of our landscapes are becoming a little less wet and maybe more available to burning, have plenty of fuel, and now climate is changing where Western Oregon sometimes can carry fire. And then other ecosystems might be on the edge of pretty dry, and with less productivity, they might become more desert-like and actually carry fire less. So when I talk with the public, I often have this teeter-totter of climate and fuels in my mind. The other thing that I wanted to just share is that we're all doing a lot to affect climate change, not on purpose necessarily, but that's a big ship to turn. However, fuel reduction treatments are something that we can really work with, and that will be a lot of the topic of my conversation today, is that the mixed conifer forests right now are not necessarily very fuel limiting. They're carrying fire very easily, but we can change that with some of our management practices, and I'll get into how we are looking into effectiveness. So one of the first places where I looked at this was way back in 2006, and it does feel like a long time ago. I happen to live in north central Washington, right where this little lightning strike is, in a small town called Winthrop. And back in 2006, we had a big fire event for us. It was over 70,000 hectares in size. It took about 2.5 months to march kind of close to Winthrop, all the way up to the Canadian border. And I happened to know after a very long smoky summer that there had been a number of fuel reduction treatments in there and harvest units. So my question for this research study was, well, I know that there were some areas that had been just thinned, and then other areas that had been thinned and prescribed burned. How well did those work? And so when I started looking at that, I also noticed that some of the past wildfires seem to have been very effective at limiting how this fire spread. So for instance, there was a 1970 wildfire that the tripod almost completely walked around. Same thing with 2003 wildfires. A 1994 wildfire was a barrier. So that was really interesting to see that past wildfires made a big difference in where the tripod was able to burn. Similarly, in the south part of this landscape, there were a lot of prescribed burn and harvest units, and I was interested in looking at how well those performed in this wildfire. Photos are really helpful. This is one of our units that we studied, and it's pretty representative of what we found. Fuel reduction treatments that involved forest thinning, leaving some of the larger trees, taking a lot of the small to medium-sized trees, and then prescribed burning really mitigated wildfire severity. So we see in this slide at the base of a unit that there was high mortality. The fire was coming into this unit and then actually kind of effectively wrapped around it, just as it did some of those past wildfires. Similarly, these kind of are strange to look at, but there was some old clear cutting up in this landscape of Douglas fir forests, and these clear cut blocks had had a site prep broadcast burn before they planted. And so there are these strange islands of green amidst a sea of gray dead trees where the fires had been burning, sometimes as a crown fire, and we're not able to burn through these units through, again, kind of a lack of fuels to carry the fire. So thinning and prescribed burning, or even this broadcast burning before a site prep was effective. So just to summarize what we found statistically is that the thin and prescribed burn units were really effective at reducing the amount of trees that died. So this actually looks at the number of trees that survived. And of all trees that we surveyed, 50% survived in the thin and prescribed burn versus much less in the controls and thin only. There was no statistical difference between those. And then the large diameter trees, the same thing. So any tree greater than 8 inches and above, we had over 75% survivorship in the thin and prescribed burns versus less than 40% in the thin only and controls. And again, no statistical difference between those. So I published a study or a couple studies on those, and I really touted the tripod complex as an extreme event, and lo and behold, treatments were effective in that extreme event. But I ate some humble pie in what I thought was extreme because 8 years later we had the Carlton Complex, and this fire was nothing like the tripod. So in a matter of about 4 days, the Carlton Complex burned the same area as the tripod complex, which took 2.5 months to burn. And so my question for this fire, after I kind of picked up the pieces after a really devastating fire event in our area, was, did treatments work at all? Was the fire so extreme that treatments actually didn't have any effect? That's actually what I thought I'd find. And so today I'm going to just kind of unpack that research study a little bit and share what we did find in it. So here's a burned area reflectance classification of the Carlton Complex, and red indicates high severity, orange moderate, a light green is low, and a green is unburned. And one thing that I wanted to kind of mention about this is that some of this fire area was actually shrubland rather than forest. And so it's a little misleading. It might seem like this entire landscape was forested, and it wasn't. What we did for our study was actually do rectangular blocks for a north study area that really honed in on forest, and a south study area that honed in on forest land as well. And these were where there was the most treatment too, meaning thinning and prescribed burn and past wildfires. So I also wanted to share the fire progression map, because the amount of fire that happened in one day for this particular fire was staggering. I know that is not unprecedented, and California has also had some crazy events too, including the summer's fires and the rim fire previously. So what I wanted to share is that these fires started as dry lightning strikes around the town of Winthrop here, and then this little community of Carlton here. And the fires moved somewhat throughout a space of a few days, but they really took off in a wind-driven event that had sustained winds over 35 miles per hour. And really, sorry, my internet is unstable for a second. I'm going to wait. All right, I'm back on. So the other characteristic about this is that we had single-digit relative humidities. Temperatures had been in the 100 degrees. It was a really hot, severe event for us. And so around 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., the fires moved this much. And then until 1 a.m. the next day, the fires ran 40 miles in distance as the crow flies in the north part, and about 30 miles in the south. It was unheard of fire behavior for us. This is what it looked like at night. These are pictures of the ember production. A lot of these trees here were open grown and actually just perished from this preheated column of smoke that completely scorched them. So we had definitely active fire spread in fire lines, but a lot of the fire was these mass ignitions from wind-driven embers. So staggering rates of fire spread even at night. And then some of the fire effects, it was amazing to see this in a kind of horrific way. So this is Alta Lake here. And we had a well-irrigated pear orchard that was preheated by a column of smoke and then actually burned over by the Carlton Complex. Similarly, a golf course actually had that preheating and actually active fire through an irrigated golf course. So when I saw pictures of this, I really didn't think that field treatments would have worked. Similarly, we had a lot of buildings burned. I know definitely the case for California, and I wanted to just recognize that the 310 homes that were destroyed in this fire impacted me. We also had many, many days of no power. And it's jaw-dropping in some of these vistas to see that ponderosa pine couldn't make it. So this was during that July 17th event. The Upper Finley Canyon had just thousands and thousands of acres of mortality. So coming then to some of our results, when I did do a burn severity analysis, I was really interested in seeing, especially during those early progressions, the July 15th through the July 18th, whether treatments were effective at all. And so we did this using Landsat TM satellite imagery and a difference of the reflectance. So this would have been from the an index of change in reflectance. So we did a lot of calibration with field studies that I can't get into right now. But basically, high severity is red, moderate severity is orange, yellow is low severity, and green is unburned, again, based on satellite image detection. What we found was a little bit promising. So yes, the pixels that were in different treatments had a lot of stand replacement, which we found would be in the moderate and high severity classes. Treatments included thin and pile burn, thin and underburn, underburn only, and wildfire. And even though we had a lot of high severity in there, a lot of stand replacement, it was encouraging to see that the thin and unburned had 40% in the low and unburned, meaning that there was that much tree survivorship, really. In the later progressions, there was definitely a lot more of the treatments appeared to work. So thin had 41% low and unburned. Thin and underburned, again, was kind of the clear winner. I was surprised to see how effective the treatments were, but I wasn't that surprised to see that thinning and underburning was so effective. That had also been the case in the tripod fire. So moving on, we published a paper in Ecological Applications that gets a lot more technical. We were using spatial autoregression techniques to basically examine models of the multivariate drivers of fire severity. And so this diagram kind of shows that we would layer on fire weather for each progression interval that we had, landform, including elevation and aspect, topographic position, vegetation, including canopy cover and vegetation type, and then also the type of fuel treatment and how long ago that fuel treatment was. All those factors could go into models of fire severity. And what we found just really quickly is that we used two different approaches, which I have not seen very much in the literature. And it was great to do that because both approaches have different assumptions. And what we found was that the same variables ended up being really important in both final models. And so that confirmed that our model inferences, our findings, were corroborated by each approach. And so with the simultaneous autoregression modeling, again, treatment, cover type, elevation, and some of the weather variables were all important. Honing in just on the treatment effects, once again, just as we saw just in those bar charts showing the different treatments, I was not surprised by this. Thinning and underburning in both study areas was the most effective, especially in the south. And again, that made sense to me because I forgot to mention this before, but the north study area had more of that July 17th spread, whereas the south study area had a lot more of the later progressions in it. So that finding made a lot of sense to us. And then moving over to the random forest modeling, that approach was really great because we were able to look at some of the relative importance of the variables, and I'll go into that first here. So basically a reduction in the kind of variability is shown here in the north study area, being the blue squares, south study area being the orange circles. And one of the things that we saw in both models is that spatial autocorrelation, how the two pixels next to each other or the neighborhood of pixels matter, came out in both models very strongly. So the signature of these fires is that they're very contagious events, and that shows up in our models of the severity. So this PCNM2 and PCNM3 in the model our spatial autocorrelation terms. So how correlated are the pixels? And then we also had wind and canopy cover and treatment being very important in the north study area, and then temperature, cover type, again, spatial autocorrelation and solar radiation, as well as treatment being important in the south study area. I was going to mention a little bit more about the spatial autocorrelation. We can't ignore it for these fires. Fires, again, move as this contagious process. And I was really kind of fascinated to note that in the north study area that had more of that July 17th crazy fire day, pixels were correlated up to 5 kilometers from one another. And for the south study area, up to 2 kilometers. And so I can't emphasize enough that as we're modeling, we need to know that there's a huge amount of spatial autocorrelation going on with this contagious process of fire. The other awesome thing about the random forest approach was that we were able to start looking at the spatial importance of different predictor variables. Again, autocorrelation could not be ignored. In the north study area, we can see where that July 17th spread was very readily, and where there was a lot of autocorrelation, fuels and vegetation, fuel treatments were a little less important. So I don't have a lot of time to go through this for today, but I wanted to give you an introduction, and it's much more explained in our paper. So just to summarize results from what we found is that my worst case scenario, that treatments would just not have mattered in this landscape, didn't pan out. I was actually pleasantly surprised that treatments were generally effective at mitigating fire severity in this landscape. Clearly, they had less of an impact on these extreme fire weather days, but they were still important. One of the things that I couldn't show graphically, but came out in our statistical models, is that we actually, through the random forest modeling, found that treatments that were located in the shadow of the wind or in the leeward slopes actually had significantly lower fire severity than those treatments that were located on the windward side. That makes a lot of intuitive sense, and of course managers would understand and appreciate that. But one of the promising things about that finding is that the winds that we had during the Carlton Complex were very predictable. They came from the west, came from the ocean, and then they burned down our valley. Our valley kind of channeled those winds. That's something that we can anticipate in the future for another summer wildfire event. And so hedging our bets with management could mean that we strategically place more of these treatments in the leeward slope of a likely wind event. I already mentioned that fire is a contagious process, and I'll get into that a little bit later when I start talking about our next steps. And then another point that I really wanted to emphasize is that to date, the area that was treated in our study areas, even though we honed in on these forested areas, was still a drop in the bucket. Non-treatment areas were still the dominant feature. And so it makes me impatient because I think that field treatments did have an effect, and I'd like to see more of our dry forests in that resilient condition rather than being so contagious for fire spread. So we haven't gotten a lot of breaks when it comes to wildfires. And so when I first moved to Winthrop in 2004, the big one was this farewell fire in 2003. Then we got the tripod fire. Then we had the big Carlton Complex event. The very next summer, we actually got a Chelan complex, Okanagan complex, North Star fires. The fires have not let up. We're definitely in this new era. Paul Hesberg, who's a close colleague of mine, has a TED Talk called Era of Megafires. And that's where we're feeling the community is definitely expecting now that we're going to have summers of wildfires, and we're starting to hopefully plan for them a little bit better. And so my questions have evolved from when I started with the tripod. What treatments were effective? Carlton, were they effective at all in such an extreme event? And now I'm really honing in with my research about strategy. How can we actually plan for these big fire events and not lose so much ground to them. Right now, what we have are these big mosaics of fires, and they're certainly bumping into one another. So that can be kind of seen as promising. The only areas that were not actively fought with ground equipment and a lot of air resources were right at the interface between the Tripod and the Carlton. Similarly, right here between the Okanagan and Tripod, didn't need very much attention because managers could see that those fires were not going to spread into the Tripod as rapidly or as severely. And so right now we're having this kind of mosaic of fires, and they are having an effect on one another, but their footprint is very large. And I don't think that that's what we really want from our wildfires. Ideally, we would have smaller wildfires bumping into one another and leaving a lot more habitat. So we have a project right now funded by the Joint Fire Sciences program to look at a lot of these wildfires and start really better informing wildland fire management strategies. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about my current research and where we're heading with all this. So one of the research questions that I'm really interested in, and several of my colleagues are too, is that we've done quite a bit of work on retrospective analysis. So a big wildfire occurs, what can we learn from it? I think we're ready at this point to think more about the next wildfire. If we get a wildfire at a particular location, can we anticipate what the fire severity would be? And can we actually then think about ways to manage our landscapes so that they're not so susceptible to a high severity fire event? So we're moving in that direction. And one of the things that we recognize for this kind of second question is that we're not able to do a lot of work with active thinning and prescribed burning. Resources are such that we're spending a lot of public funds in fighting fires, and there's not as much funding for actually doing the field treatments that many of us are impatient to have done. And so that gets into the question about, well, wildfires are doing a lot of management. I don't think we're liking all the management that they're doing, but right now summer wildfires are a leading impact on our western landscapes. Can we harness some of the late season wildfires to actually do some work for us and have some impacts that we'd actually kind of want to encourage? So with that question, we've done a really fun project. I'm just going to give you a little bit on it right now. We're just in the middle of publishing these results. And we call it the Reburn Project. And you can find a little bit more on this link right here if you wanted to kind of search our website. But the Reburn Project was inspired once again at the Tripod fire area, where my colleagues and I were talking about how there were over 300 known fire starts that were successfully suppressed within the boundary of this fire event. So we know this. We had the North Cascade Smoke Jumper Space is located in Winthrop, Washington, and they established in 1940. And so we have pretty good records of where the fires were and that they were put out in this landscape. So the question for us became, what if some of those actually been allowed to burn? What would the pre-Tripod landscape have looked like had we let some of those fires do their work? And so right now I mentioned that we have these megafire mosaics. There's one little exception here. We had a 1970 fire, and that ended up being just this little donut hole in the Tripod because it was a barrier. Other fires that we're getting are much larger than that. So we went back in time, and this was really a fun and very challenging project for us to do. I worked with Paul Hesberg, Brian Salter, Nick Povak, and Bob Gray on this, and we used a lot of fire simulation modeling plus a reference data set called the Interior Columbia River Basin Management Project to be able to backcast a 1940s base landscape. And this would take me way too long to get into right now, but basically we spun up a model that was able to run fire wild on this landscape and spin up kind of a natural fire regime on the landscape. And what we can see in the 1940s approximation that matches pretty well with what we see in the reference landscapes that we have for 1940 is a very wide mosaic of different age classes of forest. Pink is stand initiation, so this would be post-fire. Bare ground is actually post-fire, bare ground is black. Stand initiation is regenerating forest in a very young stage. Light colors are young forests, and then dark colors, the dark green and the blue, are respectively young forest multi-story, and then blue is old forest or old growth. So lots of mosaic there. We're calibrated now to some reference landscapes that we know existed in 1940 that had approximately this composition. And then we were able to, with our model, start iteratively putting fires on the landscape, starting in 1940, growing fuels forward, 1941, having the 1941 fires burn that landscape again. And we have some different scenarios that we were able to test. The simplest scenario was taking fire completely out, so no ignitions from 1940 to 2005. Our state and transition models that we built for this process would just kind of step forward every year and grow older. And lo and behold, in a mere 65 years, all of this variability went to much more continuous young forest, multi-story, and old forest. Well, this seems almost unrealistic. However, the landscape that we have here really is our best approximation of what we had, actually a pre-burn landscape for the tripod. We really didn't have very many fires from 1940 to 2005. So this actually does represent those mature forests that were ready to carry a lot of fire in the tripod landscape. In contrast, we were able to, from 1940 to 2005, allow for late season wildfires to burn. We also allowed for some summer wildfires that happened on hot, windy days to carry, because that's realistic too. Those winds would get away as they are now. But the partial suppression scenario was pretty cool. What we were seeing is that a lot of these late season wildfires started creating more of a mosaic. So we have the green, which is again, young forest, multi-story, intermixed with pole staged forests. And you can start kind of guessing that there's topography here. And sure enough, a lot of the valleys and ridges have some mosaic effects there. Similarly, we were finding that mountain cirques, like down in here, happen to be kind of wind shadows, and oftentimes there was hang time for old forests in those. So allowing these late season wildfires creates much more of a mosaic on this landscape, and would therefore have a big difference if the tripod burned through this versus this. And so I'm just going to end there and just open this up for questions, but I wanted to acknowledge first that a number of co-authors and collaborators have been doing this work with me, and we've been fortunately very well supported by the Western Wildland Threat Assessment Center, Joint Fire Sciences Program, as well as the PNW Research Station. So with that, I will open it up to some questions.
Thank you so much for the presentation. So I'll start reading off. We've got a whole list of interesting questions coming up in the Q&A, and please feel free to contribute these. We have about 20 minutes for questions, which is great. And the first off is carrying on in my neck of the woods now. Laurel Bard asked, in a lot of places in California, we're seeing previous burn areas reburning. What do you think might have been some of the factors at play that made previous wildfires effective at acting as a barrier in this case?
Right. I'm so glad you asked that, because I'm going to go back. Sorry, you guys are probably getting a little dizzy, but it's important. I'm very happy to have that question, because I've thought a lot about reburn with our reburn project. So here's a photo of a place where I would not expect it being ready to carry fire. And the reason why I say that is that in these two cases, especially maybe the thin unit, you can just see a lot of bare ground and patchiness in the fields. If I had a photo, and I don't, that showed a lot of grass cover, which we see a lot in California. These same units would actually be ready to burn right away. And so there's definitely with reburning, we can either see two things. One is that you might have a old fire scar right here that's not ready to burn for a very long time because there's not grass cover. Or in more productive ecosystems, especially in California, you might actually get a flammable shrub layer or grasslands that right away are ready to carry fire. And so we're actually seeing in the Sierras, there's a number of research studies by Brandon Collins, Hugh Safford, and others, Scott Stevens, that are showing that sometimes these high severity fire events lead to flammable shrub fields that then lead to another high severity event. And so reburn can be really kind of tricky and nuanced depending on what those understory or surface fuels are.
Thank you. And a follow-up question from the same, from Laurel Bard was, what distinguished underburning from pile burning?
Yeah, so I actually wanted to go, I went through that a little bit too quickly, and I feel like I planted this person in the audience because they're great questions. So underburning is where we actually have what we would term a broadcast burn. So the entire unit, this thinning unit, would have actually had fire burning as a flaming front through it. Whereas pile burning, we see a lot in California, in the Sierras. Sometimes we just see the piles and not so much burning, but the piles eventually get burned. And we've found through several research studies have shown that thinning and pile burning can be really effective. However, in our study, and I really forgot to mention this, our thin and pile burns happen to be kind of old in our study area, and there were actually not all that many of them. So I would not trust this result. I actually suspect that thinning and pile burning is generally more effective than what we found. It depends on how thorough you are with your piling. So, yeah.
Thank you. So there's another question from Brian Morella. For how many years after a wildfire event can we predict that this area will be protected from further events?
Okay, and yeah, these are great questions. Thanks, you guys. I'm going to come back to here. So I would say that it really depends, I think, always on your surface fuels. And I don't say that lightly. When I think about a forest fire, I'm often thinking about what is it able to burn in the understory of a forest, because we often don't get independent crown fire. Like the trees can be very dense, but they also need to have a hot surface fire to carry that fire. There's some exceptions to that rule, but it's not often. And so we are seeing probably the best case scenario here in how long a past fire can remain a barrier to spread. And that is because North Central Washington has a lot of snow, very low productivity ecosystems, not a lot of grass. And so why this 1970 burn didn't reburn, we actually walked into that stand to see why. And basically, it's a regenerating lodgepole pine forest that had very little fuels in its understory yet, and very shady. So it didn't have any grass, very few shrubs at all, and not enough fuels had dropped down into the understory to carry fire spread. And so the question about how long can we expect past fires to remain barriers to spread, unfortunately, gets to one of those annoying answers that ecologists often give, which is it depends. And so it really depends on how productive the ecosystem is. Are there flammable shrubs in the understory? Are there continuous grasses? Grasses are a really interesting thing, and I wanted to also say a little bit about that, which is that sometimes past fires or past prescribed burns do not remain barriers for very long because grass cover is such that it can carry another fire. But if a grass fire does occur, it's pretty light and low duration. And so when we think about reburning, we're not just thinking about whether a past fire scar is a barrier to spread, but also once it can carry fire, what is the nature of that fire? Oftentimes, even with these reburns that are happening in California, the very nature of fire is different because the fuels are lighter and the fire is quick duration and low intensity. So it can still have some big consequences for regenerating trees, but it is a lower severity fire or lower intensity fire. Yeah.
Thanks. We have a lot of good questions coming in. We'll try to get through them.
Great.
Brian Morella had another question. Would intentional replanting with alternative species be more suited to hotter climate, be a valuable treatment program? Would species be suitable? What species would be suitable? What would be the elapsed time frame required for such a species transition?
Okay, great question. Malcolm North has a recent TAM review in forest ecology and management. And if you guys want to email me some of these questions, I'm happy to provide the references. But he talks about strategic tree planting. And I think that we need to definitely have a lot of tools in our proverbial toolbox right now. What we're talking about is adaptive management. And they make some really good points about targeting not only maybe perhaps different species composition, but lower density planting to be more resilient into the future. And so that would be a great resource. Another thing I was just going to share is that I participated in a Climate Resilience Council set of meetings with the Washington Department of Natural Resources. One of their silviculturalists mentioned that when they're thinking about adaptation strategies, managers need more permission to experiment. And I thought that that point was so well put in that he said, right now, they're not really allowed to fail. And that's exactly what they need to do into the future. They need to be encouraged to try a lot of different species, varieties, stocking, and actually see what works well. And that as with any experiment, you're actually expecting there to be failures and to learn from them. And I thought that that was an intriguing model that management will probably need to start exploring.
Thank you. So we have another question from Juan Pablo Galvan Martinez. Do fire agencies in our area try to put out fires instead of areas near human developed land? And if so, why? Would it be more ecologically sound to let the fires in natural areas burn? I think they were trying to get at the century of fire suppression issue.
Right, right. So the century of fire suppression is so complicated. When I first started thinking about fire suppression, I really did think that it was that we had just kind of naively started putting out all the fires, and that was what had happened to a lot of these ecosystems. But I'm going to come back to, I like visuals, so that's why I'm going to it. It started before then, and I didn't realize this until I started working with Paul Hesberg and other ecologists such as Hugh Stafford and others, that way before we got good at putting out fires, which came from World War II, using a lot of the airplanes and equipment. We got much better at putting out fires after 1940. But before that, actually, there were a lot of different factors that led to fire exclusion. One of them, surprisingly, was widespread livestock grazing, which took out a lot of the fine grasses that used to carry fire throughout a lot of California, Washington, and Oregon, and the east side. So that's one of those things that is definitely underappreciated. The other one that I've been thinking a lot about is the role of indigenous burning. California had many indigenous people who had long millennia of burning landscapes. And so we've lost a lot of that management, and I'm really looking forward to learning and supporting cultural burning as we move forward. So I think that I got a little sidetracked on the questions, but the century of fire suppression has kind of a longer legacy that doesn't just involve putting out fires. But now we're really good at putting out fires. Like our firefighting force puts out around 97–98% of all fire starts. That's amazing. And unfortunately for us, the ones that get away are during exactly the scenario that we had in the Carlton Complex. Really hot, dry weather that leads to a lot of fuels being ready to burn and burn hot, and then wind. And so when I think about future fire suppression, of course, a lot of us live near the woods. I live near the woods, and we rely on firefighting. But I think we need to be more strategic about it, because effectively, if we're putting out all of those fires, we're kicking that proverbial can down the road and creating forests such as these that are tinderboxes and really dangerous for us to live near.
Susan Vallet had another question. So in California, they talk about the year-round fire season, and there's no more late seasons. Is this only applicable to certain areas?
Yeah. So, I mean, California is one of the most diverse states in our country. And when I think about the year-round fire season, that's definitely true when you think about all the way down in Southern California through Northern California. I do know that Northern California eventually is going to get rain, and there's going to be a bit of a respite, thank goodness. That said, climate change is changing the landscape, and I know that I used to live in Mendocino County, and they had a December wildfire. So it's not unheard of, but I would say that yes, as a whole, California needs to now confront the reality of a year-round fire season, but different ecosystems will obviously not have year-round fire. Fortunately, you know, Lake Tahoe area will get some snow and rain and not have fire in the middle of the winter.
So our next question is from Kristen Van Dam. She's part of a team that manages over 100,000 acres in a lot of WUI in Central California. And the question is, for a fuels management plan, is focusing on forest thinning and underburn the most important focus for fuel treatments in near WUI areas? And I guess the question would be, if not, then what?
So I would say, you know, this comes from me living in a very fire-prone landscape. I think the very most important thing would be the home hardening that all of us need to be doing. And I'm afraid that Portland, Oregon needs to start thinking about this too. But we've learned a lot about fire-adapted communities and fire-wise activities, and they work. And so I know that the landscapes need treatment and restoration, but starting out with every program, I'm just going to share what we've been learning locally, which is that my neighbors maintain their property every year now. And I think that as we move forward, fire adapted communities are definitely just a huge part of this equation. The other thing that I've been really inspired about is that some communities are investing in home air filters. And I think that that's something that we need to really think about as we confront the reality of summer wildfires or year-round wildfires. If you're in a particular part of California that's having a lot more than just summer wildfires. But being smoke adapted, I think, is a really important feature of fire adapted communities too. Will Harling in the Western Klamath area has talked about their community actually bringing HEPA air filters to people while they're doing prescribed burns. And I mention that because 30% of households have someone that have a serious health impact from smoke. So it's not to be taken lightly. Smoke is not good for us. And so when I think about a community becoming more fire adapted, it's also smoke adapted. So with those pieces, home hardening, air filters, a plan for when we do have smoke events, whether they're a wildfire or prescribed fire, I think is really essential. And then when it comes to the forest restoration, oak woodlands and a lot of the dry pine, mixed conifer forests, fire is really important for them. They're not healthy with the lack of fire, and so it's pretty exciting to think that forest restoration, including really careful work with thinning that would be done to remove the small trees and leave the larger diameter trees, and then follow-up fuel treatment, whatever that can be done is really important. So some communities might not be able to do as much smoke, and so perhaps there would be biomass utilization or tipping, but there must be a fuel reduction in association with that thinning. So long-winded, I know, but I've been thinking about this a lot.
Thank you. I'm really glad you brought up wildland-urban interface and home hardening. There's an interesting connection there, and very important. So in the time left, I want to try to sum up some of these other questions we have, and I think a lot of them are on the application, the best application of fuel treatments, such as, did you think about the, potential benefits to firefighters, and what really is the best fuel treatment plan? How far back should you go if you're considering embers? What's a best practice when it comes to fuel treatments? To sum up 4 or 5 questions here.
Okay, so I'm pretty excited about being able to answer this also with a set of publications that we're almost ready to publish. So we have one that is called Adapting Forests to Climate Change, or Forests of Western North America to Climate Change, 10 Misconceptions. And we really wanted to target some of the misconceptions that are out there in the literature around fuel reduction treatments, because we feel like they're kind of sometimes getting in the way of implementation. So what I would say is that my biggest take home from the research that I'm doing and that of our colleagues is that some of the, sorry, I'm just kind of stumbling a little bit here. Sometimes we hear, oh, we just need to thin those forests. Just need to get out there and thin. It's going to be a win-win. We'll get the commercial logging, and we'll also get this fire hazard reduction. And that's an important misconception to address, because oftentimes when we thin a forest with mechanical equipment, we're creating fuels. We're rearranging them from being in the canopy down to the surface fuels. And again, those surface fuels drive fire spread and fire intensity. And so when I think about the restoration tools that we have, there's a lot of them, but I would say that it's a mistake to think that there's just an easy solution. The other thing I would say is that we've invested as a society to a lot of fire exclusion, and now it's going to take quite a bit of time and investment to restore the resilient structure and composition. It's not going to come easily and cheaply, and so I think that there will be a lot of tools, and some of them include a little bit of managed wildfires, which as a society that will be hard for us. I recognize that. Did I answer that well enough? It was kind of a big question.
I think so.
Okay.
I guess there'd be 2 quick follow-ups because we're almost out of time.
Yeah.
And the first is if you see a benefit to firefighters with fuel treatments.
Oh, that's right. I knew there was that. Right. So one of the things that's really encouraging is that oftentimes areas that have had thinning and prescribing burning are a nice place to actually have as anchor points where burnout operations can be conducted from them or within them. We've been seeing that in a lot of fires. In the North Star fire of 2015, there was a really excellent example of a recent thin and prescribed burn where managers were actually able to go in and do a very large, hundreds of acre prescribed burn in the middle of summer. They did it very patiently and back down a hill. And their treatment was another prescribed burn that actually reinforced that unit. it didn't blow up. It wasn't a high intensity prescribed burn. It was as if they were burning it in the spring, and yet all the continuous grasses were then burned, and that area was a barrier to fire spread. And so when I think about fuel reduction treatments, I'm often thinking that they could be used in firefighting or operations in a safer way than what we're seeing right here, which would be pretty dangerous for firefighting crews to get into if there were any embers and potential for spots. There's one other thing I wanted to say about that though, which is that a misconception might be that if we do fuel reduction treatments, maybe we could put out all the fires. And as ecologists, we're not aiming for that. We're not necessarily aiming for fires to go away, because fire is a really critical process. We're hoping to change the nature of fire so it will be more benign and less catastrophic.
So with that, we're out of time. One more time, thank you so much, Susan, for your presentation. I want to remind everyone that if you're interested, we're going to have a discussion following this starting in just a few minutes. You'll be placed in a waiting room if you log in right now. There's a link that was shared on the chat. Just note that link will disappear once we log out in a couple of minutes. So please make sure to copy that down and head to the link as you sign off. And next week, Kelly Brasanti from the University of California, Riverside, will be talking about that smoke problem from an atmospheric chemistry stance. And we'll be emailing out details of that talk soon. Thank you again, and we hope to see you again next week.